And what did they do? When the war in Ukraine, to your point, in Russia, the US, the government went, oh, see, that's why we're having inflation. No, I wish that could happen to them. This is why we have inflation, because there is no fiscal responsibility around the spending, and it is oh so easy to spend somebody else's money.
Today, I have a very awesome guest, someone that I know way back for years, Lynette Zhang. And to me, she's the best thinker, the best economist out there when it comes to decoding this entire crazy financial mess that we are in. This is what we need to call it, right? And
Yes.
Lynette, it seems that there's a big disconnect in the market out there. The fundamentals, they keep collapsing. But jobs are down, unemployment is up, but the market keeps driving higher. So what's really going on? Are we all wrong about the crash? Or is the lag effect taking some time to manifest? So what's going on here?
Well, what's really going on, and I don't really hear too many people that understand this, but I was fortunate in my career, and I've been a banker and was a stockbroker at Shearson in the 80s when we were globalizing the world and moving in that direction. And in that capacity, I started to study about currencies, and I saw patterns, and I realized that currencies have a life cycle, just like every trend, just like everything on earth. For example, I have a 9-year-old granddaughter, and I'm going to be 70 in October. And I'm telling you, if you look at me, you're not going to think, oh, maybe she's going to be 10 next year. Just like you're not going to look at my 9-year-old granddaughter and go, oh my God, she's probably going to be 70. So you need to have the ability to recognize those patterns that repeat all of the time to understand where we are inside of the currencies and the financial system's life cycle. And the reason why things seem so off, and we can get into the nitty gritty if you want to, but basically the reason why the fundamentals are weird and the valuations are weird and you're not getting any good price discovery from the markets is because we are at the very end of this currency's life cycle. And I say that primarily because here in the US, we have the Federal Reserve, which everybody knows, and they've got a wonderful website. It's called the FRED, F-R-E-D. And if you go into the FRED and in the search bar, this is my very favorite chart. And in the search bar, you put purchasing power of the consumer dollar. What you will see is that officially there's 3 cents left, but it's going to where all fiat money, all of these fiat money currencies that once existed that no longer exist, go, and that is to zero. And this is the Federal Reserve telling us that that is the true fundamental value of this stuff.
Right.
So that's really, bottom line, that's really what's happening. Where do you go once there's no purchasing power left? Sound money, right? What are we dealing with? We're dealing with a currency life cycle issue. Well, how do you deal with a government debt-based money that is only money because the government says you have to use it as legal tender, right? Whereas with both physical gold is the primary currency metal, silver is the secondary currency metal, and with sound money physical in your possession, well, you now have something that is used in every single sector of the global economy. So these are money, not because the government says they're money, but because they have the broadest base of functionality and the broadest base of buyer. These things always, 100% of the time, take your pick. This is just a few examples, go to zero value. So if they push the stock market up, like that's what people are looking at, is the stock market, right? They're looking at a false trend. The real trend to pay attention to is in purchasing power. Because look at, I've got Here, this is a 500 million Venezuelan bolivar. It has more value as a napkin for an empanada, and I can't buy anything with it.
Yeah, it's quite frustrating and it's quite amazing when you actually look at how the markets are, as you said, incestuously interconnected, right? So over the past, I guess the past week, we have seen the yen carry trade just literally implode. But
Yep.
now the markets are now coming back up. So there's a very big question that we would like to consult you. Are assets being fairly priced? Are there more downsides to go, especially when it comes to the big disconnect between the stock market and gold, right? We have seen the price of gold just hover around 2000 to 2004 for over the last year. However, the stock market keeps going higher. So why is there such a big disconnect in the market today?
Because a rising gold price is an indication of a failing currency. And once you really understand that, then you make different choices. Then you pull that wealth out of the system and put it into something else that holds its value as the central banks. I mean, the only tool they have is to print, right? And every single time they do that, the value of what's already out there declines, it goes down. And so they don't want you to see that. So they must suppress the price of gold. And silver kind of straddles both worlds. So while it's the secondary currency metal, it's also, and both of these are used in industry, silver more. So silver kind of straddles both worlds of an industrial metal as well as a financial metal. And so if we've got a global slowdown, you're going to see this go down. But Wall Street, the spot markets anywhere in the world, frankly, do not reflect the true fundamental value of an ounce of gold or an ounce of silver. What they do, particularly gold, its key job is to hold its purchasing power over time. That's the most, in my opinion, that is the single most important function that it performs. And what happens is as they keep it suppressed, while, as we've seen, central banks on a global basis are buying more gold in the first half of this year than ever since they started tracking how much gold central banks are buying. So they're buying it hand over fist because they want to retain their freedom and their independence, which is exactly the same reason why all of us need to be holding physical gold and physical silver. If you want to retain your freedom, then you have to do something. Freedom is not free. We have to fight for it.
When we look at the whole global situation out there, we are seeing a lot of wrong moves made by at least the Biden White House, right? The US, a lot of boneheaded geopolitical moves that actually pushes countries away from the US and actually feeds more into the reality, not just the narrative, the reality of gold prices actually going up. And of course, referring to seizing Russia's assets. And I think that was quite a risky move going on.
Oh,
And recently, we had NATO talking about maybe we want to touch Chinese assets as well. How do you see this evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? Are we going to see this big, are going to take my money, my trade surplus, and plant it into US treasuries? Do you see that actually unwinding? And where's the money going to flow out to?
well, there's definitely a shift in the power from the West, so the US and Europe and other advanced economies, to the East. And I agree with you 100% when I think that the US showed its hand by being so heavy handed with the SWIFT, the US's global payment system, the SWIFT. And so, yeah, the rest of the world saw that and went, oh, I'm not comfortable with that, which is why we have seen, particularly since 2014, but it's also been speeding up just lately, a lot of countries repatriating their gold that were held in the US or the Bank of England or in France or anywhere else. But countries, because of the choice that the US made, there are a couple things that are happening. Number one is the repatriation and also higher gold participation of these countries, because obviously who knows more about what they're doing to this crap than the central banks that are tasked with managing the rate and speed of inflation. But the other part of it that is so critical is that there is a shift in power that's coming, and the BRICS nations have been really working hard at building the new plumbing for the global financial system. Much of that will be in digital form, but my concern for us here in the US and people here, we don't realize that we've had such a huge advantage in creating a false market with that petrodollar, because as the world reserve currency, if you were a government going outside or a corporation going outside of your borders to buy oil or lumber or medicine or steel or whatever it is that you're buying, this hasn't been true since 2000. But you had no other option but to do it with dollars. So that created a false market for dollars. But the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, they had created their internal currency, the SDR. It just stands for special drawing rights. It's just a name. But they created their internal currency back in 1969 to take over for the US as the world reserve currency, except then Henry Kissinger created the petrodollar with Saudi Arabia. But that whole system has been breaking down. And Saudi Arabia, they've joined the BRICS nations. They are selling oil in other currencies besides the dollar, but the IMF had created what's called a substitution fund. And what that is anybody that's sitting on US treasuries, any kind of government debt, bonds, whatever, or dollars, can deposit them into this substitution fund, and then the IMF converts those US dollar denominated instruments into SDR denominated instruments. And then in theory, that would give them the ability to monitor and regulate the speed at which the US dollars flow back to the US, and thereby control some level of inflation. But this is all really, quite frankly, what I'm telling you is a fact, and it's easy enough to check. Just go to the IMF and put the substitution fund in there, and you'll find it, and the SDR. But this is all part of the transfer of power from one place to another. And while I'm there, the IMF has been working very diligently on creating a universal currency, because the SDR is a basket of currencies. And there frankly are no limitations as to how many currencies they can put in this basket. So for me, when I'm looking at, we don't need to recreate the wheel. We just need to tweak, I'm talking about globally, tweak the wheel that's been in place since 1969. And it's been tested, and everybody's gotten a lot more SDRs. But then we would have one big universal currency that was easily translated into the local currency. So in the US, it would be US dollars. In Singapore, it would be Singaporean dollars, or euros or yuan or whatever. And it just makes a whole lot of sense, but I don't particularly like it, because now all we have are technocrats, and we've got a one world currency, whether or not the population recognizes that, but that's what we have.
Yeah, it's quite weird when you think about it, right? If you're the US, you have such a commanding position in the world, you have the world reserve currency. The best strategy is to actually maintain this status for as long as possible. But what do we see going on? We see massive deficits being ramped up, and if I'm not wrong, the US deficit's around 6% of GDP. And eventually, this is not sustainable. It's going to lead to two two devastating scenarios, right? Either the US Treasury one day decides, hey, we're not going to pay you, or the Treasury goes to the Federal Reserve, they monetize the debt, they start printing out trillions. So, in your opinion, which option is more likely? And what is the end game of that option? Where do people like you and me and the audience, where do we run to?
Right. Well, that's really a great question. And what history has shown us over and over again, this is what they're going to do. They're going to print the currency into oblivion. Uh, and we'll go into the globe because this is not just a US issue. This is a global issue. And the world will go into, I'm sorry to say this, but a hyperinflationary depression. And, typically, if it was just one small country, okay. But this is the entire world because as I'm sitting here telling you that there's virtually no purchasing power left in the US dollar, that's true everywhere in the world. The key tool since 1971, that's really, they say Nixon closed the gold window, so it doesn't make it sound too bad. Except what really happened was that he handed over full control of inflation to the central banks, which are private entities, right? Their job isn't really to take care of everybody. Their job is to take care of the banks. And what I'm seeing on a global basis is governments are really about taking care of governments and making sure that they stay around. That's their job. And the same thing is true for the central banks. So, I see us going into a global hyperinflationary event, burning all of that debt that they've accumulated off. And one thing was also interesting, it's 6% of GDP and not sustainable. It hasn't been sustainable in a million years. And the problem is, and I did this study myself back in 2009, we were running at that point, the US was running about $1 trillion in deficits. And if you go into the Fred, you put that in deficits and surpluses, you'll be able to see this for yourself, that even though they were doing deficit spending since the 70s, it wasn't horrendous, but it was very consistent. And I said, well, wait a minute. At that point, 2009, we were servicing about 13 trillion in debt, but we had only run $1 trillion in deficits. So there would have been a little bit of accumulation. But now when you go in the Fred, you can go back and you can go through the whole spreadsheets and databases all the way back to the beginning of whatever it is that they're tracking. So that's what I did. And what I discovered, and I sent this to a friend of mine that's an accountant because I am not an accountant. So I want to make sure that I was understanding this the right way. And what I discovered when I went in and did that was that it wasn't just that they weren't paying all of the interest on the debt. They certainly weren't paying all of the principal on it. So any interest that they didn't pay went into the principal. And now what they've been doing is compounding interest. Now, if you had a credit card and you weren't paying all of the interest on that credit card, now that interest is going into your principal and your are you ever getting out of debt?
So, Lynette, what does a hyperinflationary depression or crash look like? Does it mean that certain assets will crash more than others? Because we can always play the devil advocate with you, right? Why do I want to buy gold and silver? Why not stocks? If inflation is going to erode the purchasing power of the dollar, why not just power into equities? Why do I even bother with this archaic relic, right? As what Ben Bernanke loves to call it. Why?
Well, the reason is because if you own stocks or bonds or any other fiat money asset, all you can convert it into is this stuff. That's all you can convert it into. So if they're hyperinflating away the value of it, I'm sorry, but the last time I checked, 1 trillion times zero was zero. And if you look at Venezuela in 2000, I believe it was 2012, 13, 14, and 15, might have also been 16. They had the best performing stock markets in the world as their currency was being hyperinflated away. And then we get into those overnight revaluations where you go to bed at night and you had $1,000 and you wake up in the morning and in your bank account there's $1, but your debt doesn't go away, right? Because it's indexed to the inflation. And so why would you buy stocks? Because you can't go to a company and say, that's my brick, right? So you really have nothing. Plus, whether people realize it or not, if you don't hold it, you don't own it. And all of those fiat money products, like your stocks, your bonds, your ETFs, your derivatives, your mutual funds, all that stuff, annuities, all that stuff, those are all contracts. And that's according to the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central banker's central bank. And when they looked at what place for gold in currency reserves, their conclusions were that gold is the only financial asset, not one of two, not one of five, the only financial asset that runs zero counterparty risk. So that's one reason. The second reason, and the purchasing power is the real trend. But let's say that, what happens are people are trying to escape, and the whole system with the stock market and the currency and the inflation, you have to understand that when they created this system back in 1913, and they really thought about this hard, and they knew many things, but they knew two key things. Number one, they know that people marry the legal money of the state. So, the dollar can never go away, right? And they also knew that not one man in a million understands inflation. So inflation by design was built into the currency because governments wanted to be able to tax the population without having to go through legislation and making it visible. Because if it's visible, well, then people might complain. They might not like it. For corporations, they wanted to be able to pay their workers less and less. But hey, if you're used to getting $10, you're not going to accept $5. However, if you can make those $10 spend like $5, then they've accomplished that goal. And that is the reason why you see this income and wealth inequality around the world. So understanding that inflation was a key part of the new system that they put in place, then it makes it pretty clear, can you escape it by stocks? The stock market was designed to go faster than the speed of inflation, right? So it would move up. And when you mentioned the GDP, well, what goes into the GDP? If you have to spend $20 on a banana, that makes the GDP look better. So it's a brilliant, genius system where you create that inflation and then you flip and tax that inflation that you created. So taxation, inflation is a form of taxation besides direct taxation. And ultimately, at the end of the day, all of the wealth is transferred and you didn't really get any pushback because people didn't understand it. And as long as they could keep that rate at 2%, they got what they wanted, but you didn't change any of your spending patterns. Maybe you took on more debt to keep up with your standard of living, which obviously, with what's been happening lately, what you're seeing is unemployment meaning high debt payments and lots more defaults.
I think one of the biggest concerns gold investors have out here is we all know that the currencies are getting debased, but the price of gold seems to be just slightly keeping pace with inflation when we know there's a huge amount of dollars circulating around. Are we going to get a triggering event where one day we kind of get a revaluation of the entire system? Will it be some kind of global war where governments or the US government gets broke and they decide to revalue it to gold? Or are we going to get a kind of scenario from the East where China, Russia, maybe they peg some of their currency to gold? Maybe some kind of BRICS gold backed currency will be coming. Are we waiting for a kind of triggering event where the entire futures market that actually controls the price of gold implodes and we get true price discovery?
That could certainly happen, and it would easily happen. And this actually came very close, but they can, if traders started demanding physical delivery for all the paper contracts that are out there, they couldn't make the delivery. And so that could cause the exchange to implode. But what is more likely, and what they've done in the last, say, 10 years, is called a force majeure, where they paid that in dollars rather than in the physical commodity. What is more likely to happen is that, and what we see happening in a number of countries around the world, is that, number one, I think it's critically important for absolutely every single person that's going to invest in anything to determine what the true fundamental value of that asset or that instrument is. Because unless you do that, you have no idea if it is undervalued, fairly valued, or overvalued. Therefore, do I want to hold it? Do I want to buy it? Do I want to hold it? Do I want to liquidate it? So, as I said earlier, they have to suppress the true fundamental value of gold, the visible price of gold, because then you would make that choice, right, to buy gold. So instead, what they've done is suppressed it. So how do you know how much an ounce of gold or an ounce of silver is worth, right? It's not rocket science. I'm never going to try and get you to the penny. I'm just going to try and help you understand. Going back to that purchasing power chart, if you look on the left axis, down at the bottom, you got a big fat zero. That is the true fundamental value of this. And it's the Federal Reserve telling you that. But this is created from debt. And this is fiat money. This is sound money. Gold is sound money. So it's both the money coin, but it's opposite sides. So how do you create this? You create it from debt. So you take account of all the debt that exists in the whole, you can do it country by country, but this is a global issue. So I look at all the debt that's been created in the whole world. And the last time that I went in and I checked with the IFF, it was 313 trillion that they were admitting to. Okay. There is an unlimited amount of this as long as they can do this, there's an unlimited amount. But there's a very limited and finite amount of this. And so if you want to know what 1 ounce of gold in terms of any currency is really worth, you just take all the debt and you divide it by all the gold that exists, because gold is indestructible. And then that gives you a number. And the last time I checked, that was roughly 40,000 US dollars an ounce. Well, in the US, it's trading at somewhere around 2,500 an ounce. So what will happen is, as this trend evolves, we will most likely see a black market evolve. So you have the official price and the suppressed price of gold, and then you have the black market price of gold. And that is really more of a, since that's a physical only market, that is more of a true supply demand market. When they do those overnight resets, and they'll do that when this is con game, and this is true all over the world. I don't care where you are, it's a con game. And it requires confidence, and it requires new money constantly coming into it, right? And so what happens is people, and we're seeing it now in many places, but they lose confidence in the system. And I've been watching it here in the US just dwindle and dwindle and dwindle. So when inflation happens very quickly, that's when people start to notice and they start to lose confidence. When all confidence is lost in the currency, in the system, that's when we get the true hyperinflationary event. Though I have to say that technically, with the monetary velocity, so the speed at which money changes hands, that's already begun. I personally believe that the beginning of the hyperinflation is already upon us. You can just go in and look at the monetary velocity chart, and for me, that's very telling. But let's just stay on this. So when all confidence is lost, then what they try and do is regain your confidence. The way that they have done it 100% of the time, well over 4,800 times, is they put a component of gold back in the currency.
Yes, Lynette, to add to your point, right, it seems that the entire situation is just getting out of hand. We have seen interest rates move from 0%, right, ZERP, all the way to 5%, but somehow it magically doesn't stop Congress from spending and borrowing money. And this is the biggest concern going forward, right? There's a lot of people out there, they believe that whoever gets elected president in November or December is going to change stuff. But when we look at the policies out of the Harris camp, or whether it's the Trump camp, it all seems to lead to greater and greater spending. So is it conceivable one day that the powers that be actually get their act in order, or are we really on a one-way train, to Hotel California? Are we ever going to escape this inflationary disaster?
We can't escape it because the debt levels are so huge. And as I said, we were already compounding debt back in 2009 to a very large degree. And there's been a tremendous amount more of global debt. I mean, here in the US that they are admitting to, it's in excess of 35 trillion. And in 2009, it was 13 trillion, right? So no, we have to burn off all of this abuse plus, and you can see it. The whole world has been turned into a financial product. And what I mean by that is water has been, it's being traded, right? Energy's being traded, food's being traded, gold and silver are being traded. If you think you're not getting any good price discovery because it is not a true supply and demand market. Since we're talking about gold, let's talk about it a little bit more. And before I knew about the print screen button on my laptop computer, the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, tracks global derivatives, okay? And prior to 2008, central banks were dipping their toes into some foreign exchange derivatives, but not very much. I went in and I know I personally saw it and personally calculated it out, so I know this is true. According to the Bank for International Settlements, back in 2009, for every 1 ounce of gold, there had been created 62,000 ounces of gold derivatives. So you're not seeing, it goes back to your question, are we ever going to see a true supply and demand market? No, but when we start to do those overnight revaluations of this currency, they take gold that is all intrinsic value because it is used in every single sector of the global economy and has the broadest base of demand. And they revalue this that has no intrinsic value and he's used one place, and they revalue this against that. And then what happens, like in Venezuela, for some reason, it's just the easiest one for me to remember. That first overnight revaluation, gold spot went closer to the black market, up 3,500% overnight, while the currency and all the stock markets plunged. Now, gold too will be revalued, but on average, there's about a 9-month window. So there's all sorts of strategies around that when you look at all these different asset classes, that if you're holding gold and you're holding your purchasing power, when all of that debt makes all of those super high valuations now, ultimately either those corporations or those businesses disappear because they're too highly leveraged, they have way too much debt,
Right.
or they go to an undervaluation level so they survive, but they're dirt cheap like gold and silver are right now. Right? You want to build wealth, just put the lion's share of your wealth in an undervalued asset that's in a long-term positive trend, and the least amount of your wealth in an overvalued asset or instrument that's in a long-term negative trend. You have to determine what that fundamental value is.
I guess one of the biggest triggering events that we, could anticipate as gold investors is the collapse of the banking sector, right? But
Mhm.
over the last 2 years, we have seen a lot of shenanigans happening. The SVB crisis. After that, the Federal Reserve decided to come out with the BTFP, if I'm not wrong, it's a bailout window.
Right.
And going forward, a lot of people believes that the banking system is now going to be fine. The commercial real estate, all the loans are going to be fine because the Federal Reserve, they're going to start lowering rates from 5.5 to 4.75. So does this mean that the entire banking system is in the clear? Are we all headed to the Goldilocks zone?
Oh, God. I'm telling you, this is like an iceberg, right? What we can see is the tip. What we can't see is all the garbage beneath the surface. But this is the garbage beneath the surface, right? During the financial crisis, the whole world went down to ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, right? And they held interest rates at negative rates were a test. We can come back to that. But they held interest rates down at zero for a very long time to stimulate the economy by taking on a lot more debt and spending that money. Because when you take on debt, you're spending future money, right? Well, use this sterling silver chopstick as a proxy for how bonds work and how debt works. So it comes out at an interest rate, and then this is the market value of that debt. We had a 40-year trend where every time we would go into a recession, they'd lower the interest rates, right? And that would stimulate borrowing and spending, and therefore, quote unquote, sort of stimulate the economy. So we held them at zero for 15 years. And so all of this market value of the debt was up here, even the new debt that came out. But then they rapidly increased the interest rates, which plunged the market value of all of that debt. So it's not just bonds, it's mortgages, it's car loans, it's student loans, it's any debt is severely underwater. The banks are all severely underwater. If there is a bank run, so you brought up SVB, but this happened just recently too, and I'll go into that in a second. But there was a bank run. And so they had all of these underwater assets or instruments, hard for me to call them assets, but instruments, and they had to be liquidated at a loss. And then what did that do? That pushed the price down even more, pushed interest rates up and price down even more. So the banks, all of them on a global basis, are sitting on all of this underwater debt. It is not fine. And what's even worse than all of that underwater debt are all of the derivatives that they created from all of that garbage. And a derivative is just simply put a bet. It's like going to Vegas, except when you go to Vegas, you know you're gambling. When you buy a bond or a fund or an insurance product, you don't realize you're gambling, but you are, because they are loaded up with all of this debt that is underwater. And so if there is, what they're trying to do is keep it calm, because if there is a bank run, they got a problem. It's going to be very visible very quickly.
To add to your point, right? Let's end this on a point of preparation, right? What's going to happen over the next 2, 5, 10 years? Because we are moving towards a world of endless wars. And one I would like is maybe for your help to connect their idea about wars linking to money printing and how it actually devalues our currency over time. I mean, what have we seen over the last 2 to 3 years, right? The Russia-Ukraine war. Things aren't going so well and in Iran, between Iran and Israel in the Middle East. And what is the government doing? They have to feed this war machine constantly. And by
Yes.
printing all this money, it doesn't go to the little guy,
Mm.
right? It goes to the people right at the top, and they actually, they buy assets and they inflate everything up. So, what kind of world, at least when it comes to conflicts and money printing, are we going to expect for the next 2 to 5 years at the very least?
No, John, that's such a good question. I had done a study a number of years ago about that very subject. And I went back in the US, and what I saw is that roughly there were used to be about 52 years ish on average between wars. Because once you go into war, to your point, then they create more inflation to pay for this war. And so they would hyperinflate. People don't realize it, but in the US, we've had 3 bouts of hyperinflation and confiscation. The last one was in 33. But we certainly know the Civil War and the War of 1812. So in this country, we experience that, even though that's not the way it's sold to the population. Once they instituted the Federal Reserve, then the time between wars and what happened in 1914, World War I. World War I was instituted after the modern central banking was instituted. Because prior to that, central banks had a charter, a lifespan of typically 15 to 20 years. When the Federal Reserve was created, its charter was for 20 years, and that was 1913. That puts it at what year? 1933. In 1927, for the first time ever anywhere in the world, the Federal Reserve was given a perpetual charter. 1928, the industrialists that had driven up the price of the stock market this was also in the roaring 20s when the general public could get credit, right? So they're looking at it when the industrialists sold off enough shares to the public, then that credit was pulled away and you had 1929. But going back to the wars, what you also started seeing is that the time frame between wars became more and more and more narrow until 1989. And since 1989, the US has been in a perpetual state of war somewhere, because that justifies all of this money printing. And what did they do? When the war in Ukraine, to your point, in Russia, the US, the government went, oh, see, that's why we're having inflation. No, I wish that could happen to them. This is why we have inflation, because there is no fiscal responsibility around the spending, and it is oh so easy to spend somebody else's money. Gold inside of a currency creates restrictions and limitations around what the government, how much debt they can grow. It requires fiscal responsibility, and bigger wars happen to be one of the things that happen 100% of the time, 100% of the time in every single currency regime shift. But I'm going to say something here that is probably going to be a little controversial, but I got to say it because it's a question that I keep asking. Are you so sure that it's them against us, so one against the other? Or is that really a smokescreen to transition the system in power from the West to the East? I mean, everybody meets and they're buddies at the IMF. So what's to say that all of this and all of the wars, I mean, I know people that know a lot more about cyberspace than I know. telling me that World War III it's already being played out in cyberspace. But I can't see that. The public can't see that. They need a boots on the ground war. And all of us, we are just collateral damage.
Wow, it's a bleak note, but I guess with your help, we'll definitely be able to navigate through, this whole situation, this whole mess. So, Lynette, thank you so much for your time, and maybe you could let the audience know how can we find you, and what's the work you're working on right now.
Well, I'm very, very visible, and I have the YouTube channel, and Twitter is the same at the Lynette Zhang, and Instagram and Facebook at Lynette Zhang, and we have the website www.lynettezhang.com, and our company name is actually called Zhang Enterprises. And I know I paint a very bleak picture, but I'd really rather end on a positive note, right? And the positive note is that if you're prepared, like I can sleep at night because I'm prepared to support a community of 40 people in my bug out location right now. But as I said earlier, those very lofty valuations of income producing assets, that's going to drop to an undervaluation level. And in the meantime, gold is going to go to its fundamental value. If you're holding gold, you're buying your freedom, and you have the ability to convert into those then undervalued assets that generate income, not just for you. Legacy is very important to me, leaving a legacy for my family and my grandchildren and on to generations not born. So this is the greatest wealth transfer in history. You can actually put yourself in the position to have that wealth transfer your way, to maintain what you have and have more wealth transfer your way, and maintain more of your freedoms and your rights, because it's not where we're headed in this world. And quite honestly, I think it's ridiculous that my granddaughter at 9 has fewer rights than I had growing up. That makes me very sad.
Well, thank you, Lynette, for everything. That's a very nice, uplifting note, and hope to have you on the show again sometime soon.
Sure would. And maybe I'll show up in Singapore. I'm actually doing an event on November 30th in Australia.
Right.
So I do travel around the world because I feel like I'm the global ambassador for sound money, and
Exactly.
working hard on creating a global community. We have to come together. It's not you or them, or we, the public, must come together and take our power back.